talk on ethics and some of my work in the developing world with children's technology and research, I was asked as an expert, and certainly I do have some experience in the developing world, as well as 20 years working in Canada. But when I started to write down my thoughts, I realized that although I do have experience in this area, I'm not sure I actually have any answers for you at all. So instead what I want to do is bring your attention to some issues that have come up in my work, and I think probably come up for all of us. And many of you have probably thought of some of these things, and maybe not. But I'd like to kind of be a guide to shine some light in the dark corners that we might not want to think about, or that we don't even realize are there. And I want to bring them to the forefront of your attention, hoping that you may do what you will discover is very hard work of thinking about some of these ethical issues as you plan and conduct your research. I've worked designing and evaluating technologies for children for quite a while, and I've worked with typical children and atypical children. And as Dora said, I've worked with children that have suffered in poverty, children with ADHD, children with dyslexia, you name it. And the thing that I've realized working with these kids is that the more I work with them, the less I know. I feel like I need to have beginner's mind, because every interaction with a child is new and different and raises different issues. So I became quite convinced of how little I knew about anything when I went to Nepal and did work there. So that will be the context for this talk, background. I was in Nepal because I was asked to give a workshop with private school kids at an affluent school in Kathmandu on design thinking as part of a conference that was being hosted there. And so I did that, and then I went on vacation to the ecotourism town of Pokhara, which is in the Himalayas. And it was actually there that I began working with children who live in the slums instead of going on vacation. So there's something about this juxtaposition of Westerners who come to Nepal, they go trekking and paragliding in the Himalayas, and then I see children who are too poor to go to school, who know it's free, who are beaten daily, who don't have enough to eat, and young girls who are sold into the sex trade at 6, 7 years old for a few dollars. So there's something about that juxtaposition that made it difficult for me to do anything other than try and figure out a way to try and work with these kids. And as a scholar and a designer, I have a very limited skill set. I know how to design and evaluate new technologies for children. That's all I know how to do. And so that's all I could offer them. So that's what I did, because it seemed better than doing nothing at all. And I could have donated to foreign aid, but Nepal is a very corrupt country, and I knew for sure that any money I would donate would never, ever end up in the hands of these kids. So during the early months of this work, I asked myself almost daily, was I doing any good in the world, or was I just assuaging my Western guilt? I'm a tenured professor at a top-tier comprehensive university. I live in Vancouver, Canada, which is rated as one of the top cities in the world for quality of life. I have kind and talented friends and colleagues. I've raised 2 sons as a separated and single and gay woman with no prejudice. And because of all of these things, I feel like I have everything, every privilege that my culture affords. So I was completely suspect of my own motivation. And it's actually those doubts that led me to deeply examine my own ethical views and practices and to bring them to the forefront in my research, instead of being something I thought about after or some annoying paperwork I had to do for an ethics application. So it was this commitment to stop and really think about what I was doing that was so critical to really understanding the ethics of doing research with children, with all children. So it's really, before we can talk about that, there's 3 things, 3 parts of the foundation I want to bring out and get all of you to think about, and then we'll talk about my work in Nepal. So the first thing is just really making a commitment to take the time and make the effort to be aware of what you're doing and why you're doing it. So that's awareness. I want you guys, that's number 1 thing. And the next thing, I'm going to pose this as a question, and some of you might know this particular question, but what is the unexpected thing which most fish know absolutely nothing about? Anyone? You're not allowed to answer, you already know it. Water. So media theorist and fellow Canadian Marshall McLuhan actually said, one thing about which fish know exactly nothing is water. since they have no anti-environment, which would enable them to perceive the element they live in. A fish never understands us in water because it has no other experience than its own. And although this might not seem like it, it's really profound, so let's extend this to humans. The one thing which humans know little or nothing about is how their experience determines how they perceive and think about the world in which they live. So our own experiences, our feelings and thoughts, they're so immediate, they're so real, and they've been our focus since the day we were born. We have been and are, all of us, the very center of our own experience. We experience the world through the lens of self, and at its most extreme we might find this repulsive to think about, but yet it holds for all of us, even the most altruistic. So how do we get free of this default setting? Because we need to, if we're going to even begin to understand how our research impacts the children we work with in their communities, we need to get out of our own skin. The construction of our own minds, ourselves, is determined by our upbringings, our families, social groups, cultural practices, and norms. But for those of us sitting in this room, we've had the privilege of a higher education, and we can make a choice about what we think about. And I urge all of you to make that choice. The late American writer David Foster Wallace gave a commencement speech to Liberal Arts College, and it's called "This Is Water." Maybe some of you have heard it, and I urge all of you to look it up on YouTube. He said that the danger of an academic education is that it enables a tendency, and he said at least for himself it did, to intellectualize, to get lost in abstract thoughts and arguments inside our heads, instead of paying attention to what is going on right here in front of us and right inside of us. He reminded us that it's extremely difficult to be aware, to be attentive, instead of getting hypnotized by the constant monologue inside our heads, and I would add with our cell phones and our email. He said that teaching people how to think is really about teaching them how to exercise control over how and what they think, to be conscious and aware enough to choose what we pay attention to, and to choose how we construct meaning from our own experience, and to do this despite the day in and day out drudgery, the boredom, the frustration of our everyday lives in the grocery store line, writing ethics applications, and despite the privilege and affluence we have, which numbs us to what's going on around us. He said the work of choosing, it happens day in, day out, and we need to realize that our experience is just that. The only way we can understand another's experience is to communicate with them, to ask questions, and to really listen to the answers, to see what they're saying and try for this tiny moment to see the world through their eyes. I think this is incredibly important when we're working with vulnerable populations like children, is to take the time and make the effort to try to see the world through their eyes just for a minute, and it's not easy. So what's really important when we talk about the ethics of working with vulnerable children is that we need to understand our own belief templates. We need to be aware of the way that we construct meaning and where they come from, our cultural and social norms, where our ideas about what children should be come from. And then to make that choice to be just a little more aware. I believe as a researcher it is my responsibility to have critical awareness of the role my own meaning-making plays as I interpret my experiences, as I plan my research, as I write my ethics application, as I design systems, as I work with each child, as I collect and analyze data, and then when the project is complete, when I make statements about my research. And I make statements that I am so certain are true based on the evidence I've collected, and yet I need to be aware that I could be completely wrong and deluded. So that's the second thing. You can be completely wrong and deluded. That's the second thing. The third part is that where do ethics come from? So for a long time in Eurocentric history anyway, there's a lot of debate. There's dogmatic religious ideas of where ethics and morals come from. There are beliefs with scholars that it's completely subjective. Recently, there's been some work in neuroscience, and it suggests that some of our morality is actually hardwired. And it's hardwired because we're a social species and we need it to survive. And one of the places where it's hardwired is around empathy. So from about 5 years old and onward, we're able to imagine ourselves in the same situation as another when we see them suffering. And when we see that someone lies or cheats or burns down a house, we may not be able to exactly put ourselves in their shoes, but we sure know that we don't want it to happen to us. And so when we wish that it would never happen to us, it implies an intuitive morality about the wrongness of it happening to someone else. So our natural instinct to survive and to have self-preservation implies the wrongness of trying to interfere with someone else's instincts to survive. So many of the world's cultures have tried to codify some of these things, and for me, one of the things I like to keep in mind is the physician's oath, and it says everything or nothing in a sentence, which is basically do no harm, but it fits into this hardwired morality that I think comes with being a human being. In the realm of scientific research involving human subjects, there's a little history here in the West, and so we began to codify ethics after the awareness of the atrocities of some of the experiments with human subjects that were conducted in World War II. And so the first codification was the Nuremberg Code of 1947, and then that was followed by the Helsinki Declaration of 1964 by the World Medical Association. And this was mostly focused on research in medicine. So then in 1978, which is really not that long ago, we came up with the Bellman Report, which specifically targeted not just medical research, but also behavioral research, the kind of work we all do. And so the Bellman Report has these three basic tenets: welfare, justice, and respect. And most of your ethics boards will have built their ethics applications on these tenets. So the first one is the welfare tenet, and it's really just about the importance of protecting the well-being of children, or participants in general, and protecting them against harm. So it focuses on this sort of idea of maximizing the benefits of research and balancing it off against the possible risks. And of course, it's the job of the researchers to inform their subjects or the participants about what the benefits are and what the risks are. So that's welfare. Justice is really important because it states that the selection of participants is supposed to be fair and unbiased. It should not be determined by race, gender, age, disability, but of course it is. So justice also means that researchers should be fair in reporting their findings, reporting the negative and the positive. So the last one is respect, and it's really that idea that a person could decide at any point when they want to leave the study, and of course there has to be nothing that will happen if they do that. They can withdraw at any time. So we have these three tenets, and this is what we're supposed to do. And ethicists like to say is what we ought to do. But of course it turns out that what we ought to do isn't always what we can do, and that's where it gets a little interesting. Okay, so we have this foundation to talk about ethics. We need to be aware. We need to be aware that we're fish in water, pull back from our own self-view, and we have these ethical standards, and that sounds really easy to do. Okay, so that'll be the rest of the talk. But before I do that, I'm going to take a break, an hour's long time, and I want to do a little exercise with you. So I want everyone to stand up for a minute, and I want you to try to still the chatter in your head. So don't look at your cell phone, don't check your email, or don't talk to anyone. I want you, for maybe even 30 seconds, to take some deep breaths and focus only on your body and your breath. Let's see if we can do this. So, okay, 30 seconds, it's going to be a long time. Let's go. Okay, you made it. So that was really easy, right? Nothing went on in your head. Just thinking about your breathing. Thanks for doing that. Okay, now she probably will help you during your day to them at least once today. So being aware, getting out of that mumbo jumble in our heads is so hard, even for 30 seconds. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Okay. Before we've got this foundation, so now I'm going to talk about Nepal. But before we do that, I just want to give you a sense of the magnitude of this issue. So at my home university, which is a fairly small university, I asked their department, and they said they get about 50 ethics applications involving human subjects a year, and about 5 to 10% of those involve minors. So that doesn't seem like a lot, but there are 40,000 institutes of higher learning in the world. So if you do the math there, you realize that you get somewhere between 250,000 studies involving minors every year in the world. And that doesn't count hospitals or clinics. So it's actually a huge thing to think about, is how we work with children in a research setting. Okay, what are the challenges? So most university and hospital boards, they classify children as being vulnerable. All children, not just those that have suffered trauma or have ADHD, all children. And the reason they give for this is that children lack the necessary cognitive capacity to decide whether or not to participate in research. It's difficult for them to foresee the risks, to understand the potential benefits to their own well-being, and to understand how the conditions of research may or may not be in their own best interest. So my ethics board, and most of yours, probably say children must give assent to participate, but they're not capable of doing this. And this presents a huge challenge to the welfare tenant. And most boards say they have to be able to leave the study at any time. And yet children it's very unlikely that they're capable of making a reasoned decision based on their own welfare. And they might make it based on a whim. But being able to reason through, is this in my best interest or not, is that really not in their capacity, most children. So this challenges the respect tenant. So children who have special challenges, dyslexia, ADHD, developmental delays, or mental health issues, children living in poverty who may be illiterate or repressed, they have even less capacity to understand and give assent to participate in research. And so this challenges our justice tenant. So we haven't even got to Nepal yet, and we've already seen that it's really difficult to adhere to these 3 tenets from the Belmont report. And yet working with and for children is the cornerstone of the child computer interaction community. We cannot do our research without them, and nor should we. Let's go to Nepal. Okay, there's endless things happen there, but there's 5 things I'm going to draw your attention to, and each one I'm going to frame as a question for you about something you can think about in your own work. And there are times where these tenets were challenged and where I really on the ground wasn't really sure how to proceed, and I had to think about my own intuitive morality. I had to have empathy. I had to ask the communities and the children I worked with to try and find some kind of balance to address these challenges. Okay, let's give a little background to what I was doing in Nepal, in case you have no idea, which you probably don't. So Nepal is one of the poorest countries in the world. Millions of children there live on less than $1 a day. So I was having some downtime, as I mentioned, in the ecotourism town, and I met with a friend for lunch, and my world changed. So she was a trauma therapist named Leslie Chesick. She volunteered for a nonprofit organization that was founded in the U.S. and had a branch in Canada, and they ran a therapeutic school for young girls who lived in the slums. It's an amazing school, and it's staffed by Nepali counselors and teachers that are trained in Nepal, but are also coached in best practices from the West. So the kids at the school, they had all suffered from multiple traumas, and even though they might not look like it, they had experienced things that most of you can't even imagine. Some of them lived through civil war. They had seen their parents shot. Many of them had been sexually abused. Almost all of them were malnourished and beaten daily. And as a result of these traumas, many of these kids had underdeveloped prefrontal cortices, the place where we deal with planning, attention, executive functioning, and also really overly reactive amygdala on each side, right? That's the part that's our fear and fight or flight. So they have a hard time. They're anxious. They have trouble paying attention. They're not alone. There are millions of children in the world like this. And so they were learning and healing at the school, but it was pretty slow going. So Leslie told me about the challenges over lunch that these kids were having because of their trauma, and I had a crazy idea. And it was grounded in work I had actually done with my own son. So I had designed a biofeedback system for him to help him learn to practice how to calm down and deal with anxiety. My son is extremely bright, but has severe dyslexia and anxiety challenges. So I never published his work, it's just something I had done with him and a couple kids in the neighborhood. And so I found myself over lunch saying, I want to help. I want to use this very limited skill set I have to do something. And Leslie was very enthusiastic. And she said, we're going to school right now and we're going to talk to them about it. Because what she knew is that neurofeedback tied to counseling is one of the best practices in the West for dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as anxiety and attentional challenges. But no one had ever tried to do this in the developing world with young children who had suffered from multiple traumas. They had never used a computer. The kids hadn't learned to read and write yet. They didn't speak English. Most of them had developmental delays and severe behavioral challenges. So it was most definitely a wicked design problem. But it also raised some really interesting ethical challenges. So I'll give you the happy end of the story and then we'll go backwards. So as it turned out, over the next 3 years, we were able to build a brain-computer interface. It's a neurofeedback system called Mindful. It uses a simple commercially available EEG headset and it runs on a tablet, which is solar powered. It has 3 games, 2 for relaxation and 1 for attention. And these games were based on everyday activities that the children in Nepal already knew how to do. They already knew how to move their bodies or be in their bodies to change their brain state. So we leveraged that. And then we built a second app for the counselors there, and it let them calibrate for individual differences, because the kids can't sit still to have calibration done, and adjust the difficulty as the children go through the different games. So all of the children were able to learn to use the system and play the games in their first session. And over time, they all significantly improved on behavioral ratings related not to their ability to calm down and pay attention, not just playing the games, but in the classroom and on the playground. So we had transfer, and then we did a follow-up study and had maintenance as well. So from a research point of view, it was a huge success, and we're now just finished a second study with similar kids in Canada. But it was really grounds for a head-on collision with ethics for me. So the first place that I want to start is to look at our assumptions before we even begin our research. So I was motivated by this empathetic urge to help. Can we help? What does help mean? So we may think that children benefit from participating in our research, from using the systems that we build, but is it true? And how do we really know the children we study are benefiting? Embedded in trying to ask ourselves if we can help and if our work benefits kids, I believe it, and I think we have a social obligation to do this, but we need to be aware of the assumptions that we make about children's development, about children's education, and even what their lives should look like. There's this great book called Crazy Like Us, and the subtitle is The Globalization of the American Psyche by Ethan Waters, and it turns out he takes our attention away from globalization issues like food and mining, and he talks about the globalization of science, about the export of ideas. He makes a compelling case that the developed world routinely exports ideas that have a homogenizing effect on the rest of the world, ideas about modern theories and treatments of mental health and well-being. He suggests that this exportation, this globalization of the American psyche, is the most dangerous thing that North America and Europe export, because it undermines our ability to understand and experience diverse understandings of mental health and well-being. He brings up the example of trauma counseling in post-tsunami Sri Lanka, and talks about how the damage of the tsunami most severely impacted social relationships for these people. It created social isolation, and it stopped people from fulfilling their family and kinship obligations. So if this kind of disaster had happened in the US, or Canada, or Europe, the damage would likely have been identified in the mind of the individual and not the social. So volunteer counselors came from the developed countries after this disaster, and they encouraged and saw the Sri Lankan world through a lens of individualism. And they encouraged hyper-introspection, asking questions like, how are you feeling? And hyper-individualism, like making sure individuals were treated. But as a result of their worldview, which they weren't aware of, they were not effective, and they may have even caused further damage for these people. Because the right question to ask in this culture is, how is your family? How can we help you reconnect and fulfill your obligations to your kinship and family relations? So this kind of misplaced therapy is a result of not being aware before you even start. And you need to take that step back from your default settings and try to experience the world not only through your own education, but through another's eyes, by asking questions, and by being willing to listen and experience the world of others. And in my mind, until we can do this, we have no assurance at all that we can help. So, what do we do on the ground? Well, in my first visit to Nepal, I talked to the staff at the school about this idea, and they were very enthusiastic, strangely, and the school wanted to go ahead with it. So I spent time with the children in the slums so I could design for them, but more importantly, I spent time with the counselors and the teachers at the school so I could understand what their goals were for the children, what their ideas of well-being will be. And Leslie, who's trained in Western therapeutic methods and Western assessment methods, worked with me. So we found this balance between using Western methods of therapy and assessment to meet Nepali goals of well-being. So I came back 2 years later to run a controlled field experiment, and I had a complete research plan. I had a very detailed research protocol. I had all the assessment instruments worked out, and yet I spent the entire first week there redoing all of it with them because things had changed in 2 years for them. So understanding their goals. I can use my approaches and my methods. What are their goals, and are those two a fit? I also learned to work within their cultural norms. So just to give you an example, we set up this plan to work with some of the teachers to do the pre-assessment of all the kids. And my son actually was going to be the substitute teacher. We had a translator so he could read to the kids, we pull the teachers out. It was a lot of work to set up, and at 10 a.m. we're ready to go at the school. And one of the key counselors, Shiva, is not there. And everyone's just like, oh, whatever. So he showed up on his motorcycle a few hours later, and we did the normal Nepali greeting, which takes about 20 minutes to say good morning. And then finally, Leslie ventured to say, Shiva, we were kind of wondering about the plan we had to assess the children today. And Shiva said, yes, there are many plans. That was it. And so the plan I had in my mind is not the plan he had in his mind. And it's a cultural norm. So we laughed about it, and we talked about it later, and we did end up assessing all the children. It just didn't happen on that day. So really important, working within their cultural norms. Okay, did it help? In the Nepal study, and in this new study I just ran in Canada with low-income kids, our analysis of pre-post and follow-up data, both quant and qual, we've got cortisol tests, we've got everything. So it provided evidence that children improved their ability to self-regulate attention and anxiety in everyday life. But I still wasn't sure. So at the end of the day, I really still asked myself, is this the right thing to do? And the answer for this, I turned away from all scientific evidence, and I looked to the responses of the people on the ground who gave their time and their commitment to make these studies happen, and had champions at both research sites, and both of them asked me to come back. And for me, that's how I knew that I had done something that might have helped them help their kids. Not all the evidence, not all the research papers I can write, but they said, come back. Something to think about. Okay, so that's the first thing, is can we do any good? And how do we know? The second thing is, what kids do we work with? So another challenge that we often face is that in Nepal, the kids kind of presented themselves to me over a chance encounter, but often we have to choose the children that we're going to work with. So given the requirements of my ethics board, how do we work with kids who might most need our help, but are really unable to give assent in a way that my ethics board would be happy with anyway? So these kids had never used a computer, they didn't know what EEG headsets were, they didn't know what research was, and yet they didn't speak English. So somehow I'm going to explain this to them and ask if they want to participate in my research study with neurofeedback so it can improve their ability to self-regulate. Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? So, and I had to convince my ethics board that I was going to do this, right? So to say it was a stretch is an understatement. Where do you even start with something like this? But if we can't present our work to children in ways they can understand so they can give assent, we can't work with them. And then that rules out all of these kids that possibly could benefit from our help. Okay, we came up with a plan that satisfied my ethics board. It took quite a bit of iterations. I actually had to put some scripts through a Nepali translator on Google because they needed it in Nepali. So And then I landed in Kathmandu, and I knew it would never work. So I spent a little time and I thought about it, about what those tenets are and how I was really going to get there. And you can't tell my ethics board this, right? So they wanted me to read the script, and it was all translated, ready to go. So here's what I really did. Instead of telling them, reading the script, I decided to show them. So I showed them how you could take pictures on the iPad, and then that would show up as their ID. And this is a screenshot from one of our games. And I showed them, there's this familiar image of a Nepali girl, and she's blowing on the pinwheel, so we showed them that. So luckily I have a son who came with me on this trip. So I decided to remove the power imbalance, and he demonstrated to the kids how to play the game. And the counselor there worked with them, showed the kids what putting a headset on would look like. And the children watched my son do deep breathing to calm his mind and spin the pinwheel. And they understood this, it came from their world. He played all the different games and used his body to regulate, and they watched with that. So what's important to know here is that I wasn't in the room. So he kind of served as a proxy for the kids. I mean, he's foreign, he's male, he's not a child, but he's not an adult either. And so he showed them what they would do, and they had the opportunity through their counselor, who they have a really close relationship with, to ask questions. So this assent process happened between the children, my son, and their counselor. We video recorded it for my ethics board, but I was not there. And I think that's really important, actually. So I'm still not super clear if the kids really understood in the way I understand what they were doing, but I think they understood what they would do, that it wouldn't harm them, and they were curious and they wanted to try, and I decided that was good enough. So all of the kids gave assent, and we recorded that. Some of them, they didn't all do it in a group, some of them wanted to talk about it individually, and then they met. And their parents gave consent in a similar way. Again, I wasn't present, so parents are literate, they sang consent, which was video recorded, and worked with an Nepali team there. And I had nothing to do with this process, and it all happened in a different language, but I really worked within their culture to do this. So that's the second thing, is who do we choose, and how do we involve kids that are least able to give assent? Third thing, we faced another challenge in study design, and this is the idea that sometimes scientific rigor can cause harm, and being aware of that. So, as a researcher in HCI, one category of research that we do is this search for evidence about effective outcomes, right? So evidence that shows that whatever we designed or built works to meet some goals that we set out. And the gold standard for effectiveness is a double-blind, randomly controlled experiment, right? So this requires that neither the children or the people assessing them know which treatment the children have. And so it requires an active control group. They need to do neurofeedback, which they expect will help them, but which in fact isn't helping them at all because it's not real. It's either placebo or sham neurofeedback. And people have done studies like this here in the West. So basically you're in this situation where you're working with vulnerable kids and you're getting them, half of them, to do a treatment you know is ineffective. Because that's the gold standard for research. And it's the right answer for research design. But it was the wrong answer for me, ethically, with these kids. But I didn't abandon this idea of a randomized controlled experiment. Because if I abandon it, I'm just resorting to a case study, how do I really know that it works? Self-regulation improves with time, maturation, and learning. So if I only have one group, I can't say. So in all the cases where I suspect that I've got an intervention which is effective and I'm working with vulnerable kids, I use a waitlist control group. And that's kind of one step down from the gold standard, but it still allows me to really feel comfortable if I see effectiveness, that it's real, that it's not just kids getting older or learning something in their classroom. So really aware of how, especially using an intervention that's not real, so they think they're doing their deep breathing and the pinwheel's not spinning, like it's going to really mess with you, right? So really thinking about this, and I had the same challenge when I worked with kids with dyslexia. So in good conscience, I can't use the gold standard. I have to think about this trade-off between welfare and justice, and then think about those designs. Okay, so here's what we did. We created two equivalent groups of kids, huge variability with the kids. So we looked at age for all girls, age any kind of disabilities, attentional challenges, and we split them into 2 groups, and then we randomly decided which would go first. So we let 2 of the youngest children draw straws to determine which group would go first, again putting some control back into the kids' hands. So I call this the straw method of randomization and control experiment. It's pretty effective to me. So what's cool about that is so first of all, they saw why they were going to go first or second. And then when the kids were working, what they knew is that even though it wasn't their turn yet, they were going to get a chance. So when we collect data, we really care about this point in the study where the first group has gone, the second group hasn't gone yet, and we do between group comparison. That's really where we can talk about effectiveness. But then we do a whole other piece where we run all the other kids through 7-8 weeks of a study, and that data is actually almost meaningless in terms of looking at a gold standard, and you can look at within group effects, but it almost means nothing, but we do it anyway. So we spend all that resources to make sure that the second group gets to drill. Okay. So there's that trade-off. And I know lots of you don't focus on this kind of research where you're looking at effectiveness outcomes. You may be doing CRISPR design, as we saw yesterday, or case studies, observational work. But I think I suspect that a moment will come for all of you where you get this little feeling in your stomach, and it says that the rigor you know is necessary may not benefit the children. Or conversely, it might even happen that what you actually get this little feeling is you need more rigor to show effectiveness, and it's going to be so much work and so much time, but if you don't do it, you won't really know. So you sort of get this point in research where you get that feeling that's just not quite right, the balance between the welfare of the children and the benefit to all of you to listen to that little feeling you get and think about it. Okay, that's the third thing. Here's one I hadn't thought about. So, expectations. So when I was first in Nepal, we went and visited an orphanage that was associated with the school, and my son went off and played ping pong with some of the kids, which gave me a chance to talk to the head of the orphanage, as well as Leslie, the trauma therapist, was there. And I asked them about Westerners who came to work with the children, because of course in my little empathy here. And they told me they had a lot of challenges because people want to come, they want to help. They come for a day, a week, a month, a year, and then they leave. These kids have huge attachment challenges, and so not only does this damage their attachment, they get really attached to people, a bit of a novelty, Westerners, right, for them. But what can happen is they spend their entire lives wondering when you're going to come back and get them. And you don't. Nepal does not allow adoption outside of, their kids outside of the country, and even if it did, chances are all of these kids aren't going to go back. So there's this really interesting problem we have, and we have it all the time when we work with kids, is the kids get really attached to us, and when they're really vulnerable, to really think about how we're going to manage that relationship. So one of the things that I did is that I made the conscious decision not to work with the kids. It's really hard because I wanted to. I love them, they're great. But I worked with their teachers and counselors. There's another reason for this, but I did not spend a single minute working with the children there. In fact, I wasn't even at the school for part of the study, so they saw me come and go, and I purposely did not engage with them in any significant way so that I would not become attached, they would not become attached, and they wouldn't spend that time going, I wonder when she's coming back. When is this person going to send me money? Send my school in the West. So that's something to think about. It also applies when you work with kids here, just for design, for example. How are you going to transition? How are you going to figure out what happens when it's over? Okay, so kids work with their own figures they were attached to, people they were attached to. What happens when it's over? Of course, we think about that when it's over, but I urge you to think about that before you start. So, what legacy are you going to leave behind? I didn't know what I was going to leave behind, so I asked them what they wanted me to do, and I talked to the counselors from here that work with them there, and they said one of the principles of the nonprofit organization is this idea that they build capacity on the ground there. So, what that means is we're going to transfer skills and knowledge to the people who stay in Nepal, to the people who are Nepali, rather than parachuting in, saving the day, and leaving, right? So for us, this meant spending almost another week training the teachers and counselors on how to assess children using observable behaviors. And it was an amazing experience, actually. We created a manual, we had examples that we left behind. We had to work out how to translate from their writing of Nepali, which is in Sanskrit, into English, and back and forth. We had these great moments of connection. So in one case, one of the counselors was describing a girl as proudy. That's the English word she came up with. Okay, so we're looking for observable behaviors here. What is proudy? Well, it turns out proudy is bossy. So then I was like, well, what does bossy look like? So we had these really great discussions. And I think over the course of that week and then the 4 months of the study, we shifted some of them from their ability to have their own personal beliefs and opinions about what was happening with the kids to be able to look at observable behaviors. And because of that, they were far more able to counsel these kids, because instead of thinking, well, I know what's happening in my imagination, they were like, oh, it's these behaviors we're trying to work on, as well as my own intuitions about this child. So we left that legacy behind for them. So building capacity is really, really important, whether that's a school in Vancouver or a nonprofit in Nepal. It's leaving something behind instead of doing it all for them. And then the other piece, which they were really interested, these are the two head counselors at Shiva, who gives great motorcycle rides, and so they really wanted to understand the technology. And I was like, you're kidding me, right? And he's like, oh. So I spent another 3 days explaining how the software worked, explaining how we're going to upload all the log files, massive log files. You sample brain data 512 times a second, right? So massive files getting uploaded when there was power back to Canada, how we're going to do software upgrades, how the system works. And we also, when we left all of the gear behind. We left the tablets, the headsets, all of it, and we made a commitment to continue to work with him. You know, I had no funding whatsoever at this point. Turns out I got funding later, but wait. Okay, so technology transfer. Those are the things they wanted, and that the nonprofit was also interested in. So we reached this agreement between the nonprofit, the school, the staff there about what were the main things that they wanted us to leave behind. So I couldn't have answered this question, but I listened to them, and they told me, and I figured out how to do that. Last thing, so it turns out sometimes there's other things that you can do. And they asked for the tablets. They wanted the tablets not for mindful, but they wanted the tablets because they wanted to have tablets that they could use for, I don't know, checking their email and stuff. So of course we left all that behind, and I had to explain to my national granting agency that the equipment was obsolete, so I accidentally left it in Nepal. Because really it was just going to get recycled. So anyway, it turns out, and again I asked them, is there anything else we can do? And they said, yeah, there's this young girl at the school. I have permission to use these photos. And she came from a family, she was the youngest of 11 children, a fairly functional family for this situation. And she had a club foot, which is hard to that's our best shot of it. And so it turns out that for her to, as she would grow older, she could walk around fairly well with it, but as she got older, it would cripple her. And her society being crippled is a huge ostracization that would happen here, that she would be cast from society. And so it was about $2,000 to do a series of 6 surgeries in Kathmandu, which is really about an hour drive, but in their roads, about a 7-hour drive away. And of course, his family has no possibility of raising 2,000 Canadian, which is about 1,500 US on the current exchange rate. So they said, is there anything we could do? So I went home, and in 48 hours on Facebook with friends and colleagues, I raised $2,000. It was trivial, and it was trivial because of the privilege that I have, because of the kind of people I know who I surround myself with. And so we sent back the money, and one of her parents, I think it was her dad, and her went into Kathmandu. They spent months there. She had 6 surgeries, and at the end of it, we have a foot that works. And this changed one child's entire life. This had nothing to do with research. It had everything to do with ethics. So I urge you to be aware, even when it's hard, of what your default lenses are, of your default assumptions about what well-being looks like for children. I urge you to examine ethical tenets of welfare, respect, and justice when you plan your research, before you start, while you're doing it, when it means you need to change things, when your ethics board pushes back on you. And I think if we can do this as a community, then we can take the necessary care to ensure that our work has positive impact and that we're really contributing in ways that are important, not in our own minds, but in the lives of the children that our work is